History 112, Lecture 20, Social Challenges. One of the big challenges of the 1920s is prohibition, or the federal ban on alcohol that comes into effect at the beginning of the decade. Now, this is going to reduce drinking in some areas, but a lot of locations are going to turn a blind eye, so to speak, especially where more corrupt city governments are in place. And this noble experiment, or America without alcohol, fails within a year, and it becomes a major source of disillusionment and controversy. Now, one of the reasons it becomes highly controversial is a lot of people that are defending it, who are mainly established Protestants, are going to see it as a tool to retain dominance in the face of a growing immigrant and, in particular, Catholic population. So it takes on those sort of sectarian dimensions very quickly. In addition, prohibition creates vast opportunities for crime. A lot of local jurisdictions do not enforce the law, or if they do so ineffectively. There's only 1,500 federal agents to police all of this. The effect is going to be that it's going to turn the mob from a glorified street gang into powerful local organizations. Al Capone, for example, becomes infamous across the country and claims to control Chicago with 1,000 armed gunmen. Now, he is ultimately going to go to jail for tax evasion. Now, like him, it's going to make a lot of mob bosses extremely wealthy, and prohibition is going to lead to widespread gang violence. And during this time period, mobs are going to consolidate their power over time into a handful of factions known as families. Now, the growth of the mafia during this time period is going to lay the groundwork for later expansion to places like Las Vegas and Cuba, and also going to increase ties with Italy. Separate from prohibition, a lot of people during this time period are coming to regard immigration as problematic, and a lot of that has to do with just a few years previously during the Progressive Era when people began to associate immigration with radicalism. So in 1921, Congress is going to pass an Emergency Immigration Act that's going to cut the immigration quota from 800,000 down to 300,000 and establish a whole system based on nationality. And each nationality would only be allotted 3% of their 1910 population per year. The National Origins Act is going to come in 3 years later, and it's going to ban immigration from East Asia, reduce that quota down to 2%, and change it to 1890 instead of 1910. The effect of that is there was fewer Southern and Eastern Europeans in the country in 1890. In other words, less Catholics. So future admissions being based on that census and a percentage thereof, this means this is going to intentionally limit the number of Catholics who are allowed to move into the country. This rise in nativism also comes at the same time as there's a resurgence of the KKK. Now, the Ku Klux Klan had died in 1875, but it reestablished itself in 1915. And when it reestablishes itself, it does so as a nativist organization. The targets that the KKK wishes to pursue at this time are Jews or Catholics or immigrants. Now, what really boosts Klan membership is that Birth of a Nation is the most popular movie of the time, and people are going to really market this organization, and they're going to try to present themselves as respectable white Southerners who are concerned with social issues. They claim to be patriots and community leaders. They establish women's and children's auxiliaries, and they carefully craft an image of being law-abiding citizens at this stage. Now, the KKK claims to be the defenders of traditional values. They say that they are for prohibition and mandatory Bible study in public schools, and that they are against promiscuity, divorce, immigrants, Catholics, Jewish people, and other minorities. Now, their membership is going to surge briefly, but ultimately a number of scandals are going to bring that right back down again, and the organization largely collapses in about 1925, though it lingers in some areas all the way until World War II. David Stevenson, in particular, is one of the major Klan leaders who really comes to embarrass the Klan. He had run for Congress unsuccessfully, established a pro-Klan newspaper, and led a major recruiting drive leading to Indiana having the highest Klan membership in the nation, where in Indiana they had one-third of the adult white male population. Now, David Stevenson is going to use the membership fees to help make himself and senior members very rich. He is going to use the organization to support pro-Klan political candidates, and after a little bit of time, he is going to publicly claim that he is the law in Indiana. But it all comes to a screeching halt when in 1925 he is convicted of the rape, torture, and murder of a young schoolteacher. And during that trial, sensationally, the body of this deceased woman was described as being chewed by a cannibal. Now, the governor refused his demands for a pardon, and he David Stevenson has released a list of politicians and state officials that had taken bribes for the Klan, and the incident is going to destroy the Klan's carefully crafted image of being law-abiding citizens. And national membership falls off sharply at that point and effectively kills the Klan, when Klan membership is unable to be seen as a positive anymore. That careful marketing, where they had distracted people from the Klan's real goals by saying that they were upstanding citizens, all crashed down. Another important group that gets involved with some of the controversies of this time period are the fundamentalists, and the name of their movement comes from pamphlets printed before World War I called the Fundamentals, and these pamphlets urge a particular reading of the Bible. In particular, this movement was opposed to any scientific findings that could not be fit into a literal reading of the Bible, especially the works of Charles Darwin. Now, there is a strong evangelical streak within this movement. In other words, they want to actively convert others to their views, and they present this idea as what they call soul saving. Now, this movement has a slow start before World War I, but takes off in the mid 1920s. And increased membership during this time is really an increase in reaction to people adopting modernist ideas, especially modernist ideas about religion, and also the fall off in church membership. This movement is going to become extremely popular in rural areas, especially the South and the West. And as a result, in those areas, some fundamentalist ideas ultimately become law. Now, when some of those fundamentalist ideas make their way into law, there's a particular incident that happens that becomes very famous called the Scopes Monkey Trial, because laws in Tennessee had forbid the teaching of any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught by the Bible. So a biology teacher in Tennessee is arrested for teaching evolution. Now, this teacher is going to be defended by Clarence Darrow. Williams Jennings Bryan, who you'll remember as being the perpetual Democratic presidential candidate who could just never quite win, is going to travel to help the prosecution. In the end, this becomes a complete circus. The local judge is biased, the verdict is overturned, Clarence Darrow makes Bryan look foolish and naive, and what this ultimately means is it's going to lead to a collapse of fundamentalist political activism, and most of the country is going to perceive these individuals as backward hicks. Now, the fundamentalists are going to retreat from politics, but the strength of their belief was not damaged, and they are going to make quite a comeback towards the end of our time period. We're going to see them back off for 50 years, but during that 50 years, you're going to see this movement gain strength, and then it's going to re-enter politics in really the 1970s and 1980s. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, prohibition challenges the American perception about the efficacy of laws and the ability of the federal government to enforce them. Meanwhile, the KKK is on the rise, and nativism is taking very strong hold within the country. And those only dial back after a number of major scandals publicly embarrass the KKK. On the other hand, fundamentalism is becoming a political movement and is struggling to find a place within American society, and ultimately, through things like the Scopes Monkey Trial, suffers major defeats and setbacks. See you in the next lecture.